Welcome, everybody. We'd like to start to have John Horrigan, one of our historians, talk about the wreck of the St. John. Timely, given this is St. Patrick's Day week. Hey, John. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Well, it's wonderful to be back here in Norfolk. How is everybody? And are you prepared for the fourth nor'easter in a matter of 3 weeks? Enough already. The 7 o'clock sunset, though, will do away with the snow. Watch. So today my lecture is on the wreck of an Irish immigrant ship called the St. John, and this being the week of St. Patrick's Day. I wanted to give you an overview of not only the famine and the famines of both Ireland and Scotland, but also, you can leave that on, that's fine. Also give you an overview of the immigrant ships and what it was like to be an immigrant coming to America. You probably know me, host and writer and co-creator of a 9-time Emmy Award-winning program called The Folklorist, no longer in production. Historical reenactor, curmudgeon, and gadfly, historical gadfly. So I know that there's somebody in the room who always knows more about the subject than I do, and somebody who may think that they know more, but all I'm asking is just hold your questions until the end, if that's okay. Great, super. All right, so today we're going to look at the year 1849. We have to get back to that year. A scarcity of taties, the famine queen, the dream, the Hana, the storm, the voyage, and remembrance. So if we travel back to 1849, we'd have to go in a time machine, or we'd have to get in the car with this guy and tell you what, I ain't riding with this guy. So let's get back to the year 1849. Okay. 1849, February 28th, regular steamboat service from the east to the west begins from the east coast of the United States to the west coast with the arrival of the SS California in San Francisco Bay. Remember the Panama Canal was not constructed in 1849. You had to go all the way around the Horn. The California left New York Harbor on October 6, 1848, rounded Cape Horn at the tip of South America, and arrived at San Francisco, California after a 4-month, 21-day journey. And trust me, they made time. And that's the Pacific Mail ship, the California. On March 3rd, 1849, the Department of Interior established the Gold Coinage Act. Now, question. Who was the second 12th President of the United States? Anybody? What was that? I heard it. Zzz. Zachary Taylor. Right. I thought I heard Zach Brown, but that's a popular country western band. Zachary Taylor. So, now Zachary Taylor refused to be sworn in as president on the Sabbath. The president used to be sworn in on March 4th, traditionally. So after hearing this, Taylor's vice president-elect Millard Fillmore decided to take spirits in pre-inaugural celebration. Well, it just so happened that then if Taylor was the first 12th president of the United States of America, who was the first? If Taylor was the second, who was the first? Trust me, you don't know. This man. Hint, it was not Vice President-elect Millard Fillmore, as he had been overserved at the pre-inauguration celebratory events. It was this man. Urban legend says that David Rice Atchison was president pro tempore of the United States Senate. He was the first 12th president for a single day, sworn in on Sunday, March 4th, 1849. And March 5th, 1849, Taylor assumed the presidency. Here's an earlier photograph or daguerreotype of President Taylor and his cabinet taken by the famous Matthew Brady. Now, as I'm prone to be, I circumlocute, but it's interesting. Zachary Taylor died on July 4th, 1850, after he had a snack of milk and cherries at an Independence Day celebration. He died actually of gastroenteritis on July 9th, 1850. In the late 1980s, there was speculation that he was poisoned, so his remains were exhumed at National Cemetery in Louisville, Kentucky. Radiological studies conducted said that there was traces of arsenic at levels several hundred times less than necessary for poisoning to have occurred. So he just died of eating milk and cherries. Also, 1849, some serious fires. April 6th, Windsor, Ontario catches fire, only to be saved by the Detroit Fire Brigade. They regale them, then the Windsor Fire Department give them the finest things in the city. Literally said, come to our city and take what you'd like, boys. April 21st, 1849, 96 inmates of the overcrowded Ballinrobe Union Workhouse die from over the course of the preceding week from illness and other famine-related conditions in a record high. The dead were then buried in shallow, unmarked graves. Also, May 3rd, there was a break in the Mississippi River, the levee at Sauvage's Crevasse, and it floods much of New Orleans, Louisiana. May 11th, Minnesota became a state, 1849. May 13th, the Great Watertown Fire begins in a stagecoach shed and burns down the entire business district. And then the famous fire, May 17th, 1849. The St. Louis fire starts when a steamboat catches fire and nearly burns down the entire city with $5 million worth of damage in $1849, and 23 steamboats are lost. Spectacular people actually jumped into the Mississippi River to avoid being burned. May 25th, 1849, a lot of disasters. 10 o'clock, the steamer Empire and the schooner Noah Brown collide on the Hudson River at Newburgh, New York, and over 100 drown. And then September 1st, 1849, the first segment of the Pennsylvania Railroad from Lewiston, Pennsylvania to Harrisburg opens for service. September 25th, 1849, Austrian composer Johann Strauss Sr. passes away. Edgar Allan Poe, author, passes away on October 7th. Frédéric Chopin, Polish-French musician and composer, dies. And finally, a Russian courthouse sentences Fyodor Dostoevsky to death for anti-government activities, but he gets a stay of execution at the last minute. So they lost a lot of people. Inventions of 1849, the conical bullet instead of the musket ball, the safety pin, chewing gum, and absolute zero is discovered by Lord Kelvin. The telegraph is in use in limited capacity. Parts of Boston in 1849, as are some major coastal towns, are strung for limited service. Again, it's only 5 years since Samuel Morse sent the message, "What hath God wrought?" Of course, 1849 was the California gold rush after James Marshall found gold flakes at John Sutter's Mill on January 24th, 1848. And now let's look at Ireland. If you look at Ireland, this map here, the red numbers here are lowest class or poor people who lived in low-class housing. This is during the famine years, 1840s. This is the percent literate. So in other words, in County Mayo in the 1840s, 60% of the people lived in substandard housing and only 13% were literate. Clare, half the people in substandard housing lived there, and only a quarter were literate. Galway, nearly 50% were in substandard housing, and only 15% were literate. Down in Kerry, 60% in substandard housing, 23% literate. Moving to the east, though, we have Dublin. 54% were literate, and only 9% lived in substandard housing. Wicklow, County Wicklow, 37% literate, 28% poor. Wexford, 34% literate, 24% poor. Meath, 35% were in lower class housing, but 27% literate. And then County Down, 40% literate. So in other words, the West suffered much more during the Blight than the East. That's not to say that the East of Ireland suffered as well, but just to give you an idea. So let's move up to the oppression of Catholics in Ireland. England established in 1704 something known as the Penal Codes. Catholics could not buy land. Catholics could not inherit land from Protestants. Catholic fathers had to bequeath land equally to sons unless one was Protestant and then he inherited it all. Catholics could not lease land for more than 31 years. They had to take an oath to England and recognize the King of England as their spiritual leader. They could not hold Mass. They had to pay a tithe to support Protestant clergy. There was only one priest to a parish, and there was an exile of all Catholic bishops from Ireland. They were allowed no formal education. They could not be admitted to Trinity College, banned from any professions, no intermarriage for Catholics and Protestants, no vote in parliamentary elections, no political military offices, no guns and weapons, no horse worth more than 5 L. So you can see that that's an oppressed people. Now, the first Irish famine took place in 1740 to 1741. It was of a similar magnitude to the Great Famine of 1845 through 1852, but lesser known. This famine was due to extremely cold and rainy weather in successive years, resulting in a series of poor harvests. Hunger compounded a range of fatal diseases. The cold and its effects extended across Europe and is now seen to be the last serious cold period at the end of what's known as the Little Ice Age, which took place approximately from the years 1400 in the Middle Ages up until the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in about the year 1800. Some historians will stretch that. And within that were sub-cold periods known as the Dalton Minimum and the Maunder Minimum, which there are certainly colder periods. And within that was the year without a summer, which took place in the year of 1814, where parts of the Northeast here were so frigid it snowed in Newton, Mass on June 7th. They called it the year without wine. A lot of crops failed because of volcanic eruptions that had taken place the year before in Indonesia. So, we don't know how many people died in the first Irish famine, but in County Kerry, there are some 15,000 hearths or households, and they were reduced to 11,000 by 1742. In just 1 year, 4,000 households went away. Irish historian Joe Lee has speculated that the death rate in 1740 to 1741 was similar to that of a famine a century later, namely that 10% of the population would perish. As there was not a massive wave of overseas emigration, which took place during and after the Great Famine of the 1840s, in 1740 to 1741, it has largely been overlooked in history. The year 1741, for instance, during which the famine was at its worst and mortality was at its greatest, it was known in folk memory as the Year of the Slaughter, or Blain and Air in Irish. And my Irish relatives would hate me for saying that because I butchered it. But just looking at now, look at the famine. This is now 1845 to 1849. As I spoke about the people in the West who were suffering, they were illiterate and poor. Well, they were devastated, the darker red, devastated by the famine, arguably from the years 1845 to 1849. And lesser extent, the people to the west, or at the east rather, the northeast of Ireland, didn't really suffer as much as the people did in the west. So, it's been called the Great Hunger, and Gortamor, and Drochshall. The product of the Irish potato famine in Ireland was known as the Irish Diaspora, spreading the emigration of people out of Ireland. And you can see here's a potato suffering the blight. So, and you can see what the plants would look like. The Irish diaspora consists of Irish immigrants and their descendants in countries such as Great Britain, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Argentina, Mexico, the Caribbean, and continental Europe. It contains over 80 million people, which is over 14 times the population of the island of Ireland itself, which had a census of 6.11 million people in 2007. May I ask, does anybody have any Irish heritage in their blood? Okay. Again, there's a blighted potato. So, the blight is called Phytophthora infestans. Phytophthora infestans. I usually have to wipe underneath my mouth once I say that, but that's the blight. And you can just see under a microscope how it destroyed the potato plant, destroyed the potato, which is a root vegetable. And incidentally, the tube potato would come from South America and Mexico. During the Middle Ages, there were no potatoes in Europe. There was no corn. There was just wheat and carrots. So we think that the blight came from an area on the shores of Lake Titicaca in Bolivia and Peru. That's where it came from western central South America. And somehow it made its way onto ships and landed in Ireland, and it spread throughout the crop across Ireland. It's about the autumn of 1845 when a fungus-based potato disease reaches Ireland from South America. Nearly half of the Irish population, almost all of the western population of Ireland, was reliant upon the potato. And the blight spread during the wet spring and summer of 1846, which caused an almost total failure of that year's crop. In fact, in 1847, many people had of necessity eaten their seed potatoes, which you hold in reserve for planting, and the overall crop was again disastrously low. 1848 saw yet another crop failure. In 1849 and 1850, the blight was less severe. When the potato crop failed in 1849, famine was accompanied by cholera outbreaks, disease. This deadly cholera outbreak, an epidemic, killed one of Ireland's greatest poets, James Clarence Mangan. Now, during the time of the famine from 1845 to 1851, 1852, it's estimated that over 1 million people died of starvation and the diseases that followed. Nearly 2 million people emigrated mostly to Canada, the United States, Australia, and England. And the catastrophe was almost entirely borne by the laborer and small farmers who, because of their circumstances, under the heels of the British landlords, had nothing but the meager potato crop that they planted to sustain life. Wholly dependent. Everything else that they earned went to rent and the barest necessities. And you see these sketches pop up here. During the height of what people have called a genocide, there's another term for this, only one crop had failed and many were unaffected. Livestock still thrived in Ireland. In fact, relief efforts were stymied by the British government at nearly every level. British landowners would rather see cattle and sheep on their land than Irish peasantry, i.e. Catholics. Most of the Catholics were poor. And they made sure it happened through cold strategy while staying within the tenancy laws. It was more profitable and easier if they had cattle grazing the land than human beings farming it. In a manorial type thing, almost as serfs. So during the crisis, as hundreds of thousands of Irish people were dying of starvation and its effects, crops and livestock were actually being exported out of Ireland to England. Foreign relief from the United States and elsewhere was routed through English ports, where taxes were extracted and precious time was wasted before they could reach Ireland. Humanitarian life-sustaining aid that civilized societies normally provide to those in need was denied by the British to the Irish on the grounds that such relief would spoil them in the future. They would become dependent upon relief. That's cold. Landlords wasted no time in legally evicting Irish tenants from their homes, even though there was no possibility for them to make any rent payments. Eviction was likely to mean certain death with absolutely nowhere to go except to live in ditches, which were called scalpines. So emigration was the only option for the lucky few and was prone to end in death of typhus or cholera, or as human cargo in steerage of the ghastly coffin ships or famine ships that would go to America and Canada. The scale of suffering endured by the Irish during the famine is almost unimaginable. The following account of a visit to Skibbereen in County Cork was written by Nicholas Cummins, a British magistrate, on Christmas Eve, 1846. And I'm going to do it, and I apologize in advance for my Cockney accent. Yeah. He says, I'll do it out in front here. On reaching the spot, I was surprised to find the wretched hamlet apparently deserted. I entered some of the hovels to ascertain the cause, and the scenes which presented themselves were such as no tongue or pen can convey the slightest idea of. In the first, 6 famished and ghastly skeletons, to all appearances dead, were huddled in a corner on some filthy straw, their sole covering, which seemed a ragged horsecloth, their wretched legs hanging about, naked above the knees. I approached with horror and found by a low moaning they were alive. They were in fever, 4 children, a woman, and what had once been a man. Suffice it to say that in a few minutes I was surrounded by at least 200 such phantoms, such frightful specters as no words can describe, either from famine or fever. The demonic yells are still ringing in my ears, and the horrible images are fixed in my brain. The same morning, the police opened a house on the adjoining lands, and 2 corpses were found lying upon the mud floor, having been devoured by rats. A mother, herself in fever, was seen the same day to drag the corpse of her child, a girl about 12, perfectly naked, and leave it half covered with stones. In another house, with 500 yards of the cavalry station of Skibbereen, the dispensary doctor found 7 wretches lying unable to move under the same cloak. One had been dead many hours, but the others were unable to move either themselves or the corpse. That's suffering. So, landlords evicted their tenants. People were forced out of their houses into the frigid, damp, cold Irish air. How many people lost their power in any of these storms recently? Okay. And a day, 2 days, 3 days. I mean, you're literally 2 days, right? It's frightening. I mean, you're exposed to the elements. No electricity unless you had a generator, no hot water. But it's frightening. They were left and exposed. Now, there were attempts by the tenants to halt the evictions, but the riots were always brutally suppressed by the local constable with support from Protestant gangs. During the years of the famine, a decline in the population set in Ireland, one which has continued almost to the present. For instance, in 1841, the population of Ireland was 8.2 million. 10 years later, it had declined by 2 million to 6.2 million. In 1976, the population of Ireland was 4.7 million. But as I mentioned previously, in 2007, it had climbed to 6.11 million. The famine queen. Queen Victoria, born May 24th, 1819, died January 22nd, 1901. Not a favorite of mine in history. She reigned from June 20th, 1837 until her death on January 22nd, 1901. She was known as the Empress of India. And under the Victorian era, under her rule, the British people enjoyed a long period of prosperity as profits were gleaned from the expanding British Empire overseas. Domestically, there were improvements in industry, architecture, literature, art, and a large educated middle class developed. Sound like America 100 years ago? It was known as the Pax Britannica, the Peace of Britain. That's, of course, if you ignore the brutal suppression of India. And it was the age of liberal imperialism. They were known as limps, and where they tried to hold on at the close of the 19th century and as the 20th century opened, they tried to hold on to British holdings throughout the world unsuccessfully. So, Queen Victoria turned a blind eye to the crisis in Ireland and contributed only £5,000 sterling to the famine relief effort, which today is only a mere £70,000. Lord John Russell, depicted here, and his ministry committed democide. That is, a deliberate policy of negligence rather than of a planned killing. Kind of what the United States did to the Native Americans after the Civil War, a democide. The Irish population, as I mentioned, lost some say 2.2 million people. And then for the British, Ireland was no longer a military threat. So, the Irish famine was proportionally more destructive of human life than the famines of modern times. It killed an eighth of the Irish population. And according to historian Joseph Judge, he said the calamity was essentially man-made, a poison concoction of blind politics, scientific ignorance, rural suppression, and enforced poverty. The famine became a major platform for emigrant anger, as the political liberties and freedom of opportunity they encountered in America confirmed for them the potential of an independent Ireland, and it made them more passionate than their brethren at home. In other words, once they reached America and saw the riches of America and the freedoms, it made them more resentful and bitter and wanted to stir uprisings and to throw England out of Ireland. It unfortunately caused more division between the Protestants and Catholics. So in the late 19th century and throughout the 20th century, English writers emerged, and they drove Irish revisionism, that is, in literature and art, to undermine the basis of Irish nationalism so as to leave Ireland without heroes or historical memory. Now, as a historian, I'm encountering this with African American history as I look in. There's been an eradication of African American history, or it was just totally ignored. So it's very, very difficult to find books and writings of African American history from the 19th century. It also played down the responsibility of the English government for exacerbating the famine. They would not take responsibility. So only recently, in 1998, did former British Prime Minister Tony Blair accept responsibility for the actions and inactions of the British government, and he offered a sincere apology. Now, let us not forget our Scottish brothers and sisters. The Scottish Highlands suffered a potato famine during the same period as the Irish famine, as their potato crops were also blighted by a fungal disease. Only this one lasted 11 years, 1846 to 1857. So, relief, oatmeal was distributed in daily rations, 24 ounces per day for a man, 12 ounces per day for a woman, and 8 ounces per day for a child. Crofters or workers were not given these, or beggars rather, were not given these rations. They were expected to work for them 8 hours a day, six days a week, just to eat. Now, destitution roads were built throughout the craggy Scottish hills to expedite the eviction of peasants. So imagine, peasants were hired to make roads so they could quickly evict and remove evicted peasants down the lanes and paths. Most landlords simply wanted the extermination of the population, although some landlords actually paid for their passage to Nova Scotia and Canada. Again, the landlords would rather have cattle grazing on their land. It was more profitable than having peasants that couldn't make crop and make their payments on their land. In Wick, Cromarty, and Invergordon, grain was being exported out of Scotland from local harbors. Now, The Fields of Athenry was written by Pete St. John and first recorded by Irish ballad singer Danny Doyle in the 1970s. It was recently popularized by the Boston-based rock band called the Dropkick Murphys in 2003 on their album Blackout. Note, my brother Jeff helped write the song Tessie. That was a hit for the Red Sox. But essentially, Michael is deported to Botany Bay after stealing corn to feed his starving family. So if you don't mind, I'd like to play that and we can look at the lyrics.
By a lonely prison wall, I heard a young girl calling. Michael, they have taken you away, for you stole Trevelyan's corn, so the young might see the morn. Now a prison ship lies waiting in the bay. Low lie the fields of Athenry, where once we watched the small free birds fly. Our love was on the wing, songs to sing. It's so lonely round the fields of Athenry. By a lonely prison wall, I heard a young man calling. Nothing matters, Mary, when you're free. Against the famine and the crown, I rebelled, they cut me down. Now you must raise our child with dignity. Low lie the fields of Athenry, where once we watched the small free birds fly. Our love was on the wing, we had dreams and songs to sing. It's so lonely round the fields of Athenry.
So, the story is he's taken away from his family for stealing corn to feed his family and put on one of the prison ships, which would result in almost certain death. And I'm not going to play the Dropkick Henry's version. It's a little too rock and roll. But he's deported to Botany Bay after he tried to steal corn. They say Trevelyan's corn, and what that means, that's a reference to Charles Edward Trevelyan, who was a senior British civil servant in the administration of the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland in Dublin Castle. And he's one of the primary culprits of inaction, as his reports to London understated the severity of the famine and insisted that problems would arise if the starving were assisted in any manner. So that's why they call out Trevelyan. And his Trevelyan's corn may not have meant Irish wheat, but likely a reference to the relief maize that was being imported from America and was illegally being siphoned off from warehouses and then subsequently sold and exported. And then the other grain that was left there was left to rot on the docks. So, the final Irish famine took place in 1879. It was called the Mini Family, or Angora Biag. And essentially it caused hunger rather than mass deaths due to changes in the technology of food production, different structures of land holding. There was the disappearance of the subdivision of land. There was income from Irish immigrants coming back, which were sent to relatives, and a prompt response from the British government. So radical Irish Member of Parliament Charles Stewart Parnell of the Home Rule League, later its leader, Michael Davitt of the Irish Land League, and some Irish clergy, notably Bishop Logue of Raphoe, were actively involved in campaigning to put pressure on the British government and in the distribution of aid. It was largely focused in the west of Ireland in the province of Connacht. It was part of a wider series of food shortages and crop failures which swept Ireland again in the 1870s through the early 1890s, and there were notable food shortages in 1877, 1878, 1885, 1889, 1890. So, other countries also experienced famines and food shortages due to crop failure, with some climatologists suggesting a series of unusual weather patterns, including extremes of weather, very dry or very wet, especially in the summer, or very mild or very cold winters. This triggered problems with the growth of food, making it easy for the spread of disease among plants and killing off new seeds. So, many were afraid of a repeat of the failed harvest of 1847. So emigration from foodless parts of rural Ireland went to major cities and towns, and population moves proved temporary. With the reappearance of the harvest in 1880, they had a good crop. More people went back from the urban areas back to the rural areas where they had left. And of course, during that time, there's a lot of tradition. A lot of the Irish folk music evolves during that time in the mid to late 19th century in Celtic music. So, and there was Our Lady of Knock appeared in Knock County at a church, an alleged apparition of the British Virgin Mary seen by children. So, there were the 3 F's: fair rent, fixity of tenure, and free sale. And in 1985, Irish rocker Bob Geldof, and the founder of the mammoth benefit concert Live Aid, announced that the people of Ireland had given more to this fundraising effort per head of population than any other nation on earth. Irish acts like U2, the Cranberries, Van Morrison, Sinead O'Connor, and the Chieftains also performed for charitable causes. And there are other relief charities like Gold, Concern, Trocaire, and Gorta playing a major role in helping famine victims in Africa. And there's a famine memorial in downtown at Boston Crossing between Washington Street and School Street. I don't know if anybody's ever seen it. It's very moving. Again, some other pictures of the famine memorial. So, let's look at how they had to leave Ireland when they had no food, had no future, had no hope. They had to leave while they could. Maybe there's a new beginning across the sea. There was talk of a better place. So here's the wreck of the Hana, 1772. This is before the Great Hunger. The Hana's hull was laid in Maryport, Ireland, in Ireland, and it left on April 3rd, 1849 during the famine, bound for Quebec. Captain Curry Shaw was displacing 150 to 200 tons. He had 200 Irish emigrants on board along with 12 sailors. Well, they struck an iceberg at 4 a.m. on April 29th, 1849 in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. First and second officer put the lifeboats out and got in it and left everyone else on deck. Many were in their night clothes, and they were leapt into ice floes and slid off into the icy water. There was a bark called the Nicaragua, and it saw a distress flag a little after 5 p.m. They saw over 50 men, women, and children freezing to death on one large iceberg. Some had been crushed to death between the massive ice chunks. And Captain Marshall observed, he said, "No pen can describe the pitiable situation of the poor creatures. They were all but naked, cut and bruised, and frostbitten. There were parents who had lost their children, children who had lost their parents. Many, in fact, were perfectly insensible. The number got on board the Nicaragua was 129 passengers and seamen. The greater part of these were frostbitten." So there were 50 to 60 were crushed to death between the ice floes or frozen to death. And finally, the ship, what was left of it, arrived in Quebec on May 14th, 1849. And the fate of the two men who took the lifeboat, the two sailors, the first mate, is not known. But it just shows you the dangers of getting on board these coffin ships. Even if you survived the ride without having a disease come upon you, if you got into any sort of maritime danger at sea, whether it be an iceberg or just an inadvertent sinking, you're on your own. But there was one good ship that made many journeys called the Jeanie Johnston. The Jeanie Johnston would make 16 Atlantic crossings and bring over 2,500 Irish immigrants to the United States and Canada. Now, the transit, this is by Dick MacDonald. The transatlantic crossing by sail ship in the mid-19th century was a highly unpredictable and dangerous expedition for the weary Irish, many of whom were starving and malnourished from the effects of the Great Famine. Though well-run and regulated, the Jeanie Johnston offered few comforts for the 2 months or so at sea. Conditions were harsh. Passengers were housed in very cramped and grim bunks, had access to limited food provisions, and had to withstand many variations in weather. Toilets were practically non-existent. When they arrived at the other side, they had to experience difficult conditions at the quarantine stations in North America, such as Grosse Isle in Canada, which were set up to protect against the spread of diseases. So, now let's talk about our story. It's New England. We all know about nor'easters, okay? This one comes up, the October gale of 1849. If you look at the winter weather from 1849 through 1851 in New England, it was very violent. In fact, it would result in the toppling of a lighthouse, which is another lecture. So this gale came out of the tropics and was reported to be roaring through the shipping lanes in the Middle Atlantic on Friday, October 5th, 1849. We know that the rain began in New York City at 10 a.m. on Saturday, October 6th, 1849. The barometer dropped to 29.6 millibars at 9 p.m. and the wind was blowing out of the southeast. Okay. The peak of the gale in New York was between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. and inflicted severe damage, according to the New York Tribune. By dawn, the barometer had dropped to 29.30 inches. The wind shifted to the northeast. It's a nor'easter. In the 2 days of the gale, 2.43 inches of rain were measured. In fact, the Presbyterian Church on 29th Street in New York collapsed. Now, there was an exhibition pavilion at 8th Street and 4th Avenue where two large dioramas by Daguerre, who created the first primitive forms of photography, daguerreotypes, they were on display, and they were blown down and they tore a priceless canvas nearly 1,000 feet long, assessed at $5,000 in 1849. And it's known as the first photograph of a man or a person, right? I don't know if you see that here. Man looking at his boots here. So, 1849. That was destroyed. So the wind and the barometer measurements at Sag Harbor in Long Island on Sunday, October 7th, 1849. At 6 a.m., the wind was east by north, the barometer at 29.14. By 9 a.m., the wind was east-northeast, barometer 29.13. By 3 o'clock, wind out of north-northeast, barometer dropping again, 29.11, and then by 6 o'clock, the wind was blowing from the north, the barometer reading climbing to 29.35. 6.5 inches of rain fell in 33 hours in New York. The storm center passed along the eastern tip of Long Island. Most of the great hurricanes that have struck New England, whether it's the great colonial hurricane of 1635, Saxby's gale of 1869, the great September gale of 1815, or the Great Hurricane of 1938, all seem to have the eye passed on western Long Island, and they tend to move, the eye wall tends to move up the Connecticut River Valley or along the Cape Cod Canal, which is today. So at Fort Trumbull in New London, Connecticut, 6.15 inches of rain was recorded. Providence, Rhode Island, the heaviest part of the storm came during the early morning hours of October 7th, but the barometer didn't dip to 29.09 until 3 o'clock that afternoon. Amherst and Framingham reported severe damage. In Nantucket, quote, it blew with great violence from midnight until 2, but caused little damage, according to the Nantucket Enquirer. And at Provincetown, at the tip of Cape Cod, some small fishing vessels were lost when they broke free of their moorings. So, Rain began to fall along the New England coast at 6 o'clock on Saturday, October 6, 1849. By midnight, a violent gale was blowing from the northeast, and the rain was falling in torrents. By Sunday, October 7th, telegraph lines, trees, and chimneys were down, and sea vessels were being driven onto the land. All telegraph communication to the south of Boston ceased. They had limited telegraph communication, and again, they were strung up on poles that weren't the most robust holding devices. In Chelsea, one of the walls to the Universalist Church was blown down, and 2 inches of snow fell in Temple, New Hampshire, which was 10 miles north of Massachusetts border. So obviously, this is a nor'easter. Now, is anybody familiar with Cohasset, Scituate, offshore? They have a lot of rocky areas that have taken many, many ships. It's an area called the Grampuses. And we're talking about this in the upper left-hand corner. In fact, I'm not sure if I mentioned it, but John Smith, the same John Smith who claims that he was in Jamestown and with Pocahontas, right? And then the same John Smith who said he walked across Russia. Well, this John Smith, he actually came to the Charles River in 1614, and he managed to start the first Anglo-Native American fight when he got into a fight with some of the Quanahasset Indians, or Conahasset Indians in Cohasset. But anyways, I'm straying here. Whenever I can get a shot at it, John Smith. Construction, 1849. Because of the Grampuses, and let me go back to that, because there was just so many ships were taken over the years there, over 100, they had to put a lighthouse out there to warn ships off. Okay, so they decided to construct a lighthouse on Minot's Ledge, and it was completed, ironically, after the wreck of the St. John. And its first lighting would take place on January 1st, 1850, but the irony is that this was under construction as the St. John came in. In fact, the New England lighthouse storm, and sometime maybe we can come back and talk about it. It's an amazing story about 2 lighthouse keepers who fell into the sea with a toppled Minot's Ledge light. That would fall on April 15th, 1851. Shameless plug. So, Scituate had been the scene of countless shipwrecks. Between 1832 and 1841 alone, there were 40 wrecks on this neighboring group of rocks known as the Grampuses. So, between 1817 and 1847, it was estimated that 40 lives and $364,000 worth of property had been lost in shipwrecks in the vicinity of Minot's Ledge off of Scituate, Mass. So, now, one of these Irish emigrant ships is leaving Ireland. It's called the St. John. It's a brig. It displaces 200 tons. Carrying Irish immigrants, its owner is Henry Comerford of Galway in Ballykeed House, Kilfenora. The captain is Mr. Martin Oliver of Galway. There's a crew of 9, not including the captain, so 10. So the passengers, there are 110 passengers from North Clare and Connemara. The St. John leaves Galway, Ireland on September 5th, 1849. They don't know what the weather's going to be like. They don't know that this is the height of hurricane season. She made Cape Cod Light at 5 p.m. on Saturday evening, October 6th, 1849. So it took a month from Ireland to Cape Cod Light. They threw down the anchor, and the captain passed a ration of grog to his crew. He's celebrating. He suggested to the passengers that they celebrate their last night on board the St. John. Cruel irony. By 1 a.m. on Sunday, October 7th, 1849, the St. John stood away northward from Scituate Light, about 2.5 miles out to clear the land until first light, and she would remain there till about 4 a.m. So when they're talking about Scituate Light, they're talking about the lighthouse that's known as Bates Lighthouse. I don't know if you're familiar with that in another story, that the Bates sisters, Abigail and Rebecca, supposedly in 1814, 1815, played a fife and drum to ward off British raiders who were coming in. That was a famine year, coming in to steal fruits and vegetables. They acted as if they were a militia as they played their drum and fife behind the sand dunes. The British didn't want to fight. They turned around and went back out to their ship. An American army of 2. When the dawn began to break, the captain tacked, and the St. John stood south-southwest. The captain was calling the weather, though, very thick. The ship was being driven southward towards Cohasset Bay, so she came inside Minot's Ledge, very dangerous, where a lighthouse was inoperable and still under construction. That's the mine sledge light, number one, that was being constructed. So, at 6:30 a.m., after seeing the British brig Kathleen anchored near Hookset Rock, the captain tried to lend assistance to her, but he found that he could not fetch up and assist the Kathleen, which was now foundering badly. So, taking the lives of his the people on board his ship, he wanted to help save another ship that seemed to be foundering dangerously. He didn't know that they had already evacuated the ship. He threw over both of the St. John's anchors, and at 7 a.m. they began to drag anchor. If you drag anchor, you're at the mercy of the ocean, the currents, and the waves, and the wind. She began to drift swiftly towards Grampus Ledge. Her sails were now shredded. Helpless, hopeless. Captain Oliver then decided to cut away the masts of the St. John. That's your last hope to prevent getting dragged and blown, to actually saw off the masts. Now, meanwhile, the event is being witnessed by residents of the Glades house just offshore. Enormous breakers repeatedly lifted up the ship and hurled it against the rocks, and the captain would later recall that these waves were mountains high. A hole was broken in the hull, and those who were below deck were drowned within minutes. The brig then began to break up. It was getting slammed against the rocks and the waves. And you saw what happened to the seawalls in Marshfield and Plymouth with these past nor'easters. Imagine that force. Nothing you can do. People now gathered on the shore and were horrified to see people being swept off the deck by the dozens and into the boiling surf. Even though the wind howled and the surf pounded the shore, witnesses swore that they could hear the screams of the victims. And this is a famous rendering of the wreck of the St. John, which appeared in the popular magazine of the time, Harper's Weekly. And if we just take a quick look at this, and we didn't have any photographs, but you can see it's caught up on the ledge. Pieces are being thrown ashore. This is the life-saving crew, brave men themselves, people in the boiling surf, just getting thrown ashore, helpless. So, the jolly boat, which is a smaller boat, hanging by its tackle alongside until the stern rigging broke. The boat fell into the water and was being swept away. Captain Oliver, the second mate, and two of the crewmen, who were two apprentice boys, jumped into the maelstrom to secure the boat. But just then, about 25 passengers jumped into the water and swamped this jolly boat, this longboat, the rescue boat. Only Captain Oliver survived as he grabbed a rope that was hanging from the quarterdeck, and he was pulled aboard by the ship's mate and the nephew of the ship's owner, Henry Comerford. The longboat was then launched, and several passengers jumped into the water to reach her. None of them did, and they all subsequently drowned. People clung to wreckage and were slammed onto the barnacle-clad rocks. The captain, the first mate, Mr. Crawford, and the remaining members of the crew, and I've had debate over this, was it 7, was it 6, was it 8? Only one passenger reached the longboat. Now, a lifeboat from the shore, the shoreman, is launched from the land towards the brig Kathleen. They see the Kathleen at sea, and they'd say, well, we can save more people out there than we can with the St. John. They thought that everybody had evacuated the St. John, and that there were a lot of people on board the Kathleen. They were wrong. They flipped it. So they went out to try to save people in the Kathleen. And they assumed that everybody on that longboat were the only passengers on the St. John. And again, there was spray, howling wind. They didn't realize that 200 people were in peril aboard the St. John. By 4 p.m. on the 7th of October, 27 bodies had washed ashore, 21 women, 3 men, and 3 children. Austin Kieran, Catherine Flanagan, Betsy Higgins, Mary Keane, Michael Fitzpatrick, Michael Gibbon, Barbara Keneally, Mary Slatterly, Michael Redding, Honora Cullen, Honora Burke were among those who were saved. The reason why I mention their names, some say that some of those folks settled in the Scituate and Cohasset and Humrock area. So if you know anybody with those names in that area, they should check their lineage. They may be related to these people. Patrick Sweeney of Galway perished along with his wife and his 9 children. Mr. Lathrop who sheltered survivors in his house, waded into the surf to retrieve a parcel of clothing, and he quickly realized that he had an infant in his arms. And the infant was said to have been in excellent health and lived. The St. John was in charge by 8 a.m. 8 women and 7 men made their way to shore almost dead of exhaustion. 21 people were saved, 99 were lost. That's my best estimation. Some had to have their hands pried off of the flotsam to which they were clinging. People like Mr. Holmes, a railroad conductor, lined the shore, anxious to help rescue the living and retrieve the dead. All 7 first-class passengers were lost, including 3 nieces of the ship's owner, Mr. Comerford. And then, quote, a man clung to a timber with his mouth open, skin a deep purple, fixed teeth, and bulging eyes. By nightfall, 46 bodies were recovered. Word gets to Boston. The Boston Bee, newspaper of the time. They're right, it's about 100 drowned, men, women, and children. So, this guy, who was a rock star, just getting into his zone, Henry David Thoreau in Concord, hears about it. He reads the posts of the news and he talks to a friend. They were going to go to Cape Cod. Well, why don't we go by way of Cohasset to witness the destruction? And, you know, he wrote something called The Shipwreck several years later in 1865. Again, this took place on October 7th, 1849. And he was kind of callous. And, I don't know, I lost some respect for him when he wrote these words that I extracted from The Shipwreck. Essentially, what he wanted to do is go down there and see some dead bodies and maybe poke at them with a stick. So he says, on the whole, it was not so impressive a scene as I might have expected. If I had found one body cast upon the beach in some lonely place, it would have affected me more. I sympathized rather with the winds and waves, as if to toss and mangle these poor human bodies was the order of the day. Why care for these dead bodies? They really have no friends, but the worms are fishes. And that's what Thoreau said. So today, as we wrap up here, there are monuments. Grosse Ile Monument in Canada. This was the first stopping ground for Irish immigrants. These photographs taken by Dick MacDonald. Every year the Hibernians go up. I'm a member of the Ancient Order of Hibernians, Division 14 out of Watertown. In Lettermullen County, Galway, the Star of the Sea, Rialton Amara. There's a wood carving of the Brig St. John on the back of the church door. Also, there's a memorial stone written in Gaelic from where they left. And then in Cohasset Central Cemetery, there's a memorial cross that was erected by the Ancient Order of Hibernians on May 30th, 1914. They recently had the 100th anniversary commemoration there to celebrate. And that's something that, if you're interested in this event, to find that Hibernian cross. So that's my talk for today. I know it's rather tragic and there's not much happiness about this, but the Irish, along with the Italians, the Germans, the Swedes, Jewish people, came to America and made their way through Ellis Island. And today, the diaspora of not only the Irish, but the Italians, Germans, Jewish, Swedish, of all nations, Chinese, and that's what makes us the melting pot. But some had to take risks like this to get on board these ghastly ships. So thank you so much for listening to me. And I hope you have a nice day. Thanks.